Shocking wins for democracy in India and South Africa, fixing the baby crisis, Britain's economic future, and a flood of cheap Chinese exports threaten developing economies. These are, in my opinion, the most important stories that we need to talk about in this economic update, produced in collaboration with The Economist. So let's dive into our first story right away, which is about India's shocking election result, in which Prime Minister Modi unexpectedly lost the absolute majority his party had for the last 10 years. But thanks to his coalition parties, his government still has a majority, and so Modi can keep governing India. So then, why did India's stock market plummet upon the news, and why is The Economist calling this a triumph for Indian democracy? Well, according to The Economist, the stock market's initial fall can be explained by the fact that ruling in a coalition will likely slow down or weaken some of Modi's proposed labor reforms and manufacturing subsidies, which is bad for businesses. On the upside, this outcome means that India is now less likely to become an autocracy for two reasons. First, Modi's BJP party and their allies now lack the two-thirds majority needed to mess with the constitution. Second, while Modi's authoritarian style helped him push through some big reforms like infrastructure investment, a digital identity system, and a reformed financial sector, the country now needs more politically sensitive reforms at the state and local government levels to grow further. A coalition that considers multiple viewpoints could potentially coordinate these reforms more effectively. After all, as The Economist points out, India's successful reforms in the early 1990s and 2000s were all made in coalition governments. Indeed, as I will explore in my upcoming video about why India can never grow like China, I think that this election result could potentially push India onto a more sustainable, somewhat slower development path, such as the one followed by countries like the United States, Germany, and Japan. However, this story isn't the only shocking yet hopeful election I'm closely monitoring at the moment, which brings us to South Africa's shocking election result, where after years of economic decline, rampant corruption and increasing crime, the ruling party, the ANC, finally lost its majority, dropping from 57.5% of the vote in 2019 all the way to around 40% today. Therefore, the ANC can no longer rule alone and has now announced that it will pursue a so-called government of national unity. According to The Economist, the ANC had two options based on which coalition parties it would choose: the path of left-wing populism on the one hand and the path of centrist pragmatism and hope of renewal that it ultimately chose on the other hand. Despite South Africa's dwindling economic importance, this choice has huge implications for the global economy, as South Africa still holds the title of Africa's most industrialized economy. It still dominates the southern part of Africa, and it holds some of the world's largest reserves of minerals like gold, platinum, and manganese. So, what does a government of national unity actually mean for South Africa? If the ANC would have followed the path of populism that it initially seemed likely that it would do, it would have either teamed up with the firebrand Economic Freedom Fighters, EFF for short, which wanted to seize and redistribute farmland and nationalize mines, banks, and other big companies without compensation in the style of countries like Venezuela or Zimbabwe, or with a newly formed MK party of the former ANC president, Jacob Zuma, which also wanted to nationalize banks and businesses and on top of that reform the judiciary to prevent it from going after corrupt politicians. But since both these parties made unreasonable political demands, for instance the MK party wanted the current ANC leader Cyril Ramaphosa gone, the second path, teaming up with the main opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, DA for short, is the path that the ANC has chosen, be it under the umbrella of a so-called government of national unity, which includes some other small parties like the Inkatha Freedom Party. The DA has a proven record of governing relatively well in places like the Western Cape, where it has the majority. This, along with their business-friendly policies, is why The Economist considers this path the most sensible option. And having started this channel in Cape Town, South Africa, I agree for the most part. While the DA's record is far from perfect and controversial in a divided South Africa because it's sometimes still seen as a white party, there is no denying that the Western Cape is one of the best run provinces. And given the terrible state of public services in South Africa in general, I really don't see how teaming up with the party of the legendarily corrupt Jacob Zuma or radical economic freedom fighters could lead to anything productive. But given that teaming up with the DA was opposed by many in the ANC, President Ramaphosa initially indicated that he wanted to pursue a government of national unity, which included both the liberal DA and the radical EFF parties. But the EFF quickly rejected this option because it did not want to work with the DA. So it could also actually have been that this was a smart strategy by Mr. Ramaphosa to end up in a coalition with the DA, which he can now defend by stating that the EFF denied him his preferred option of a national unity government with a left-wing and liberal party. So perhaps South Africa's economy will finally see some better days under new, competent leadership. This hopeful fate it may share with its former colonial master, where Britain's upcoming election battle could mean that on July 4th, Britain finally ditches the conservative Tory party that presided over years of relative economic decline. Indeed, if the election was to be held tomorrow, The Economist's election model predicts that the opposition Labour Party would get well above the 326 seats needed for an absolute majority. This is a big change from 5 years ago, when the Conservative Party easily secured the majority over Labour. And while, like South Africa, Britain's economy has become less important, I still believe this election is crucial because a change of government might just be what Britain needs to get out of its relative economic decline. The Economist writes it believes that while Labour's politicians are still too timid, the left-wing opposition party is still better positioned to tackle crucial problems like housing and Britain's relationship with the EU. However, as we've recently seen in France, even if reformist-minded governments may look good on paper, they might pave the way for a far-right surge if they do not deliver on high-minded promises and therefore disappoint the electorate. But that election battle may need to be explored in the next episode, as the results are still very unpredictable. Similarly, I decided not to feature Mexico's election story, where, as predicted by most models, President AMLO's chosen successor Claudio Sheinbaum won by a landslide, which likely means the country will continue on its current path. However, Mexico will still play a crucial role in the next big global story, which is about how India, Mexico and Brazil are taking on China's exports. A headline which refers to the fact that while emerging markets like India, Mexico and Brazil were hopeful that it was now their turn to replicate China's manufacturing-led growth miracle, they instead risk becoming consumers of a new flood of cheap Chinese manufactured goods, especially after the United States and European Union announced a lot of new tariffs on Chinese imports. The logical consequence of Western markets closing off is that now even more cheap Chinese goods will find their way to developing economies, putting in danger their emerging industries. Indeed, The Economist quotes Jorge Guardo, Mexico's former ambassador to China, as saying, "The biggest threat of Chinese overcapacity is to developing countries." Therefore, developing countries are now responding by seeking Western trade deals and imposing tariffs and other barriers on Chinese imports themselves. However, these emerging countries will still need cutting-edge Chinese technology to develop their own manufacturing industries, making this a delicate balancing act for them. For example, as India builds new barriers against Chinese imports, China is already retaliating. As The Economist quotes one Indian executive who says that China is quietly restricting Indian access to crucial solar equipment. In response, some developing countries are now trying to convince Chinese manufacturers to set up local factories there, just as China convinced German, Japanese, and US firms to build their factories in China decades ago. However, The Economist warns that developing manufacturing in key sectors like batteries and electric cars may be especially challenging now, as the West has recently copied China's strategy when it introduced its own subsidies to bring these types of factories back home. And yeah, I agree with The Economist there that developing manufacturing in some of these sectors will be really hard in the current global environment. However, I would like to add that a Chinese and Western subsidy race might unlock brand new growth strategies for developing countries, where they could, for example, profit by importing these subsidized products while developing manufacturing capabilities in less trendy industries. That is, if these countries are able to get their industries going before they get old. Because, as you can see here in this graph, the number of countries that have a fertility rate below the replacement level of 2.1 is now already roughly 100 and is only projected to rise. As a consequence, the number of countries where the population is already shrinking will soon surpass 50 and will inevitably continue to rise further. This is why I think The Economist's analysis about how to escape the global baby crisis is the final most important story about the global economy right now. You see, desperate to turn the tides of falling fertility, countries are now spending massively on family benefits that are, as you can see here, very expensive, costing about 3% of GDP for countries like the Nordics and France, a percentage that translates to roughly $2 million per baby in France, while having only a limited effect. Indeed, as you can see here, the only rich country with a birth rate that is above the replacement level is Israel. At the same time, big spending in the Nordics and France has just kept them around the same level as the United States, which spends far less. Still, none of these countries have seen quite such a dramatic decline in fertility as South Korea, as its birth rate plummeted to just 0.7, meaning that by the end of the century, South Korea's population is expected to fall by a whopping 60%. So why are these spending programs failing to stop the fertility crisis? In this cover story, The Economist argues that they largely failed because they got the underlying problem wrong. Most governments still think the main reason women have fewer kids is that they are more highly educated now and thus want to establish a career first, meaning that they have kids too late in life and therefore have fewer of them. In response, typical schemes have aimed to make it easier for women to have babies and have a career at the same time, for instance by making childcare cheaper and offering generous tax breaks for every baby that they have. However, The Economist argues that the real reason for the decline is actually that younger working-class women are now having far fewer babies. Indeed, as you can see here in this graph, it is really that women from 15 to 19 and 20 to 24 years have gotten far fewer babies, as education around this topic increased and contraception has become much more readily available. Indeed, evidence from France, Israel and Norway suggests that bonuses that target working-class mothers specifically have been much more effective than bonuses for everyone. This may be why Russia, China and Hungary are now introducing new baby bonus schemes that specifically target women below the ages of 30 and in some cases 25. But The Economist argues that governments should not try to convince poor young women to have more babies because they might undo decades of work spent trying to curb unwanted teenage pregnancies and to encourage women to study and work. Cash incentives for older, high-income women won't work well either, The Economist says, because they don't seem to want many more babies than they are already having. Therefore, governments should spend a lot of that money on how to deal with population decline rather than to try to fully eliminate it. And yeah, I thought this was a really interesting take, even though I don't fully agree with it. Specifically, while I agree that giving baby bonuses to working-class moms might not produce miracles in countries with average fertility rates like France and the United States, I could imagine that it would be money well spent for countries with extremely low birth rates like South Korea. But perhaps more crucially, given that even non-Orthodox Israeli women have more than 2.1 children, I think this demonstrates that raising fertility rates to the replacement rate should be possible in rich countries. We just haven't figured out how to do it yet. But I'm sure that when researchers figure it out, we can read all about it in The Economist. Now, while I've covered this week's top 5 stories in this video, there simply is no better way to stay completely up to date about the global economy than by subscribing to The Economist, which offers access to in-depth global coverage on a daily basis. An Economist subscription gives you unlimited access to their website and app, where you can find the latest coverage of world events, such as why rich baby boomers are so stingy, as well as podcasts and newsletters that leverage The Economist's network of global correspondents to keep you up to date about specific regions, like the Trump Tower newsletter, which recently provided an in-depth analysis of Putin's and Xi's increasingly chummy relationship. What I really like about The Economist is that they stand for independent journalism for independent thinkers. That is, they provide multiple sides of a story, and as you've seen throughout this video, they are actually open to people like me reviewing their work, agreeing, disagreeing, and adding different perspectives. This is why The Economist has been a part of my media diet since well before starting this YouTube channel. And while I love savoring their print edition over a weekend coffee, I especially like their app, which continuously serves me the latest digital weekly edition and daily updated online-only articles no matter where I am. So if you want to have access to rigorous reporting and in-depth analysis explaining what is going on in the world right now, then start your free trial with The Economist today by going to economist.com/moneymacro or by clicking the link in the description or top comment below.